research in visual ways. Welcome to the Communicating Research in Visual Ways with Research Retold, sponsored by the Student Concerns Subcommittee. So we'll begin with our land acknowledgement. I recognize that we're meeting here on a virtual platform today, but we should each take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we're each located. So we acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples across Turtle Island. So we invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside, because we are each in very different geographic locations, by checking out nativeland.ca. It has a very interactive map that's pretty interesting to check out. My name is Alicia Clifford. I am a PhD candidate at McMaster University. I'm also on the Student Concerns Subcommittee and the Decolonization Subcommittee. To engage in the conversation, so Zoom will generates closed captioning, and it's available for accessibility purposes as a live transcript. So if you want, what we'll do, there'll be some interactive portions where we'll use the chat. Our presenter will ask you that. But also, if you want, save your questions and you can put them in the Q&A, and we'll be addressing those questions after the initial discussion. So your name and question will be visible to all attendees, and attendees can upvote questions if they want to put them to the top of the list to be addressed. A little bit about Research Retold. I had the great fortune to actually see a presentation by Research Retold on how to communicate your research visually through my institution at McMaster, and then signed up for their newsletter, and then participated in the Now What program. It's a 4-week program that will guide you through how to create a 2-page visual based on the research you're undertaking. So for me, it was my PhD dissertation, and it was a fantastic program, and I highly recommend it because it really helped map out concrete steps for how to do the work. And there's lots of examples. It's clear cut, helps with plain language, get rid of the academic jargon that we're also used to. So yeah, check out Research Retold. And today our presenter is Mihaela Gruia. She's a social and data scientist passionate about the intersection between research, communication, and design. She's the founder and director of Research Retold, a specialist research communication service with a vision to make research accessible and to have a positive impact in society. Research Retold supports academic researchers and evaluators to engage with non-experts by making their findings digestible and enabling their research to be acted on. The visual summaries produced by Research Retold have been used by researchers to engage with policymakers, business leaders, industry experts, the general public, and the media. Please welcome Mihaela.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be with you this afternoon. I'm in the UK, so it is 4 p.m. in the afternoon where I am. I can't see all of you, but I'm really thrilled to be here and so honored by the invitation from Alicia to be talking to you today about communicating your research in engaging and accessible visual ways. Normally when I run these workshops, they are a little bit more interactive. There are exercises and group work and pair work, but the style we've opted for today is more of an introduction and a primer into the topic of communicating research in visual ways. And yes, the slides will be available for those who will be looking for further resources, and the recording as well. So it's more about me talking and you taking notes, which is not how I usually like to run these workshops. And Alicia will know I really like interactive online events. But we have 1 hour and 15 minutes today for presentation, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. If you have questions along the way, please write them down and we'll have some time to answer them. But if it's just me talking to you or talking, it was just the information flow is just from me to you. It's just the format we've decided on today. So I'll be sharing my slides and I will be starting my presentation. So normally I will ask people to give me thumbs up if they can see my slides. But just to test this out, if you could say yes or no in the chat that you can see the screen okay, it will just allow me to, oh, there we go. So let me just look. Yes, perfect. I can see your answers. Thank you so much, everyone. Lovely. Normally, also, I run some polls throughout the session, but I think to keep it simple, I'm just going to ask you, not having any Zoom polls, I'll just be asking you some questions along the way, and you can just use the chat function to say hello, to answer the question. It will only be me who sees the answer, so you should be okay. Brilliant. So today we'll be talking about communicating research in visual ways. And Alicia introduced Research Retold. We exist. I set up this company, I should say, 7 years ago. I set out on a mission to help researchers communicate their work in more engaging and accessible ways. And oftentimes people ask me how I got into this, and it wasn't just one experience that led me to this. It was a combination of putting together lots of different experiences and things that I saw that were happening around me in the workplace I was in Brussels, where I saw the power of communicating information, robust information, in engaging ways. I used to work in public affairs and communications, and that's when I met Annette, who was a graphic designer, and she was producing these amazing infographics based on EU reports, European Union reports that were coming out. And I saw this one-page infographic one day, and I thought, wow, this looks really good, and the information here is also robust. And it just dawned on me, why does this not happen with research that comes out of university? So I started this journey, and I pitched this business idea to a group of people, and there was one academic in the room who said, I'm going to be presenting my research to a group of very busy cinema owners in Hollywood next month. Would you be able to help me put together a very quick one-page document about my research, what it is about, what's the solution, what's the method that I used, and what are my key recommendations for this audience? And it was amazing. It was the first ever client, and we helped him with this infographic. And then I said to myself, well, if I can find more academics, more researchers who might use this service, then maybe I'm onto something here. So it was a slow process in the making, but here we are today helping researchers across the world communicate their insights into engaging formats. We'll talk about formats and what formats can you use as a researcher today, and we'll cover that. And the aim today really is to help you think about your research from the perspective of an ideal target audience that you might be communicating with. Giving you lots of ideas, tools, practices, and inspiration from case studies. So this is a taster of the organizations that we worked with. We have worked with actually two organizations in Canada. McMaster University, we delivered a workshop there in 2019, and we worked with CPA Ontario, the largest organization for chartered professional accountants in Ontario, and we helped them to communicate insights that they were producing in collaboration with Canadian universities. So the process of research communication, I'm going to be giving you a very brief overview in the next slide of what we mean when I say research communication. What is the repeatable process? We will define it then, and I'll give you an opportunity in a little bit to answer a few questions. I'm interested to hear your thoughts as well. So at a glance, what is this repeatable process of research communication? What are the steps that we usually go through? Actually, before I do that, I just wanted to explain that typically, when we run workshops like this, how do we communicate research in visual ways? People are interested to go straight to that visual element, that how can I make my research into an infographic? But I always pull back from that, and I explain to people that there's a wider process that you need to be aware of, that you just turning your research into a visual that you think looks cool can be more effective if you actually embed it into a wider effort of communicating your research by understanding who is your audience. Therefore, you build empathy with them, and you are able to target your messaging towards who they are. You capture the central message of your research that you want to communicate in that format. You then pick a suitable format, and that might be the infographic, it might be the visual summary or a policy brief, or even a gallery or an exhibition or an animation. There are so many different options, but the format that you choose is informed by the audience that you are targeting. You then flesh out the content. You go through this process of figuring out how to communicate it, what accessible language can you use, and what visuals do you want to pick. And crucially here is where you want to get feedback on your document before you're disseminating it. And then finally, you share it, you get reactions, you get feedback, you track your activities, and you follow up and see whether you've achieved the goals that you had in terms of communication. So from the get-go, I want to ingrain this idea in you that research communication is a process, and this word will come up again when we look at the definition. But it's much more than just producing a cool infographic, as much as that is my favorite part of this job. So there's three major steps that I'm going to structure the presentation, rule of three. I always like to think in threes. What are three parts that we could go through logically together today? We're going on a journey to understand the step-by-step process that we are going to go on if, theoretically speaking, you are thinking of creating a visual summary based on your research. So let's start by defining what is research communication. What do we mean by this? It is a definition here on the screen. I'll give you a second to read it. So what I want to draw your attention to in terms of this definition is the process. It is a process. It's not a simple activity that you do, but it's actually one that takes time, effort, considerable effort, skill, and consideration. So you are interpreting, or shall we say translating, not in the context of translating from one language to the other, but you're almost translating from academic speak to human speak, to non-academic speak, to a language that someone who is outside of the academic bubble in which you operate on a day-to-day basis can understand what you are talking about. And it's the language that you use, the format in which you are going to create it, and then the context when you are sending this to people so that they are receptive to what you have to say. In addition to this, the process the process that you go through is that of transforming the raw research output into something that addresses the express needs of beneficiaries. And I say this because research communication does not happen in vacuum. You need to communicate to someone, and having that audience filter and that audience profile in mind can then help determine what messaging you put in, what you leave out, what is the most important message to capture in this engaging format that you are putting together. It's always important, and everyone has different reasons why they want to communicate their research beyond academia, but I want to give you a second to reflect for yourself. Why do you think it's important to communicate your research beyond academia? And you can just think of one reason and drop it in the chat for me so I can have a look. And then I'm going to offer 3 reasons that I see researchers that we collaborate with give all the time. So have a moment to think, why do you think it's important to communicate research beyond academia? I'm going to keep an eye on the chat for your answers. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Diana. Margaret, Esther, thank you. So we have to inform public policies, to have more impact, disseminate knowledge, to make social change, to even get feedback on your research. So to make your research better in the process, to help with policy initiatives, to make it actionable. It feels important for designated marginalized or designated vulnerable communities to have access to information about themselves. Otherwise, it feels exploitative. To create change and to do that, you need to go outside of academia. Fantastic. So you are touching on many of the reasons that I see researchers give in terms of why they feel it's important for them as researchers to go outside of their bubble and to communicate their work. In brief, the main reasons that I want to share with you are very, very similar, and they overlap. The first one would be to increase the visibility of your work. I mean, there is an ongoing debate online about how cited, how read, outputs of academic papers are actually accessed by people. I mean, open access in itself and barriers to access are a debate in and of itself, but increasing the visibility of your work, being able to communicate the key messages and to have that go and spread far and wide. The second one is to stay in control of your narrative, whether you specifically set out to engage with the media or whether you don't want to do that, but the media may pick up on research that you are involved in or producing or finding that you report on. There is a risk there that they could be misinterpreted, and what gets out in the media then spreads far and wide on social media, and it can really lose sight of that core message that you wanted to get across. So by publishing an accessible and visual and engaging summary of your work, you can stay in control of the information that is put out there, and people can always go back to the source. If they find your name or find the research that you're working on, they can access something that they can easily understand. And finally, the world needs robust evidences for decision making. So it's now more important than ever that robust evidence gets in the hands of those who can do something about it in a positive way. Now, in terms of that first step that we would go through to start communicating our research in visual ways is to think about our aim. Why do we want to do this? And who is our audience? And for this next slide, I'm going to give you two scenarios that I see researchers find themselves in terms of how and when they communicate their research to different audiences. So on the left-hand side, we've got the demand-driven or top-down approach. And in this scenario, external stakeholders specifically request evidence from academics. This is usually referred to, or can often be referred to, as public consultations or requests for evidence, and so on and so forth. Each country either names it differently, or I've seen it being referred to in different ways. But essentially, someone is asking for this information and reaching out specifically to you, to your group, to your university, and saying, what is the latest evidence on this? What evidence do you have to support this? And in this scenario, your aim is, it's a little bit easier to define what the aim is, because there's been an explicit request for information, or you'd hope it is anyway. You're responding to something that's been officially created. Whereas in the push mode approach, the bottom-up approach, and this is where most of the researchers that we work with find themselves in, the researchers themselves are proactive to create that digestible material and disseminate it to targeted stakeholders. So here you're trying to, there is a gap in terms of the evidence that these researchers are using, but you are the one who is taking control of how that communication takes place, and you're producing this material and then proactively reaching out to people to let them know, hey, we've worked on this. This might be useful for you, what you are working on, what you are developing, and here's our results. Let's arrange a further chat. But in both of these situations, the ability to create a digestible or visually engaging document is going to be extremely useful and necessary. And no matter what scenario you might find yourselves in, what we're going to be covered today is going to be helpful. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to give you some different audience considerations. Again, because this is not an interactive workshop where I can ask you what we can't work together on a specific audience, I wanted to cover as many audience considerations as possible and to give you as much information as possible to then think about how it applies to your own research. So I'm going to cover public sector, businesses, third sector organizations, and policymakers as the four main audiences that we see researchers wanting to connect with regularly, and what considerations you might think about when starting that engagement. Now, the first one is the general public. And when I say general public, it is a very general and broad category. If you were to come to a more hands-on workshop and say, my research is aimed at the general public, my immediate question to you would be, well, what segment of the general public? Can we be more specific? So if that is you, I would really want to encourage you to be more specific about what you mean by that. But if you're aiming to communicate to the general public, these questions that you see on the screen, and arguably you should probably answer these questions for any target audience that you have, but especially so when you think about the general public, you should ask yourself, well, why should people care about my research? How does this relate to their daily life? And what is the story that I'm trying to get across? Is there a way that I can wrap up my findings or communicate my findings, I should say, in a story that will relate to these people's lives. So an example that I'm going to give you on the screen is that of social prescribing. Now, social prescribing is a phenomenon that refers to support that someone can get in the community to overcome certain issues that are affecting their life. They don't have to be health-related issues. They can also be related to other aspects of their life. But if you type in social prescribing and you put in the National Health System in the UK, the NHS, it will come up with a bunch of diagrams similar to the one you're looking at on the screen. And they can be very dry and not very engaging if you are actually trying to show this to a member of the general public, explaining how they might access the support that they need. So a group of researchers that we've worked with from the University of Sheffield here in the UK wanted to communicate what social prescribing does, but to a general public segment of the population. And so together we produced a comic that uses this metaphor of the mountain and a person climbing the mountain with the support of a community worker to be a metaphor for that journey that someone will go through in their social prescribing journey. Now, I'm not saying that if you want to talk to the general public, you must prepare a comic, but I am saying that I need you to think about the story that you're telling someone and that you're going through that is informed by your research findings. So very closely with how we communicate to the general public is engagement with the media. Media does a lot of writing for the general public. And so I want to offer here the insights of a commissioning editor from The Conversation being a very well-known, at least in the academic space, news and media outlet where only academic researchers can publish in. And I'll come on to that in a little bit later to inspire you perhaps to have a look at it, see if your own university is part of it, and see if colleagues of yours have published in it or whether you could do that yourself. But here's what she says. Think about how you'd explain your research to a friend, family member, or even someone at the pub. Your work needs to feel accessible to a general audience. Think about the story you want to tell and what you can relate this to that will help people understand your work. And people like Holly see hundreds of pitches every week in terms of academics, researchers pitching their work to a general public audience. So I think her insights are very relevant here. And in The Conversation here, they talk about timeless, plain explainer, timeless, plain explainers of complex issues. So as a site, as theconversation.com/CA for Canada, you'll be able to type in the keyword of your research and see what are people writing about this and how are they communicating about it, crucially. Okay, when it comes to policymakers, here I want you to think that policymakers are not necessarily experts in their field. Just because we say policymakers, we do need to contextualize it for them to communicate within the context of that policy decision that's being made or policy proposal that's being put forward. So keeping it simple is certainly an advice to keep in mind when you are communicating to to policymakers. Don't assume that they know what you have researched. And this is a series of visual summaries that we produced for one of the government departments here in the UK. And behind these are 40-page documents of evaluation reports, but they needed to communicate that in a more engaging and visual way. When it comes to businesses, I really like Tony Carroll's quote here. He's a business development manager for one of our universities, and it says, my #1 tip for researchers when it comes to engaging with businesses would be to keep it simple, simple. KISS as an acronym. If you wish to maximize your appeal, remember more detailed analysis can always be used as a follow-up once businesses have expressed initial interest. And this is a principle that really goes a long way in research communication, to think you can always follow up with more detail and you don't have to give it all away in that short page document that you are presenting. And this is an example of 4-page visual summaries produced for local businesses in Coventry that Tony was taking to business organizations to connect researchers with them and create collaborations. Finally, when it comes to engaging with the third sector, here are the insights from monitoring, evaluation, and learning manager of one of the largest NGOs we work with, Fair Trade International. You'll probably recognize their label from your fruit in the morning. They say we've transformed very text-heavy reports into sharp and easy to understand visuals for internal and external communication. So they're very used to having information presented in this visual way. So if you are targeting this audience, certainly keep in mind that you want your document to be engaging and visual. So what are the questions that we might ask ourselves when we start this process? So I'm going to put these 5 on the screen. Now, after this workshop, I will endeavor to create a little handout for you. So you'll have the slides, but I'll have it all into a 1-page handout where you can that you could go through for your own research. And ideally, I'd like you to actually fill this in and start to practically work on your own document. So what's the aim of communicating my research? What do I want to get out of this? Why am I doing this? What am I hoping to achieve with it? There are different ways you could formulate question 1. I want you to be really clear for yourself, beyond those general reasons that we gave in the beginning of the workshop. What is in it for you? Why are you trying to do this? What is the purpose? Secondly, who's your audience? Are you in a demand-driven approach? Someone's asking for information and then you're going to find out more information about those specific people. Or ideally, if you are being proactive, well, who are the top 3 people you'd like to speak to and why? If you don't know who the people are in your industry, then now is the time to figure out what organizations are in this space. Who are the key players in this industry I'm in, and who would I like to speak to? And don't just say the WHO or the United Nations. Who, what department, what team, and within that team, what person? What's their current position on the topic? What are their current gaps in their evidence base? And arguably, this is the hardest one to answer if you don't know these people directly. But you can glean an insight into their position because you might know that there is a gap. But what are their current gaps? I mean, you might know that there is a gap in the evidence because the research that you are doing is one of a kind, and you know it's no other research like this has covered that specific topic. What's their current position on the topic? You might glean that from what organization they're part of, what's the political current at the moment, what's the general feeling when it comes to that topic. It's very hard to talk in general terms, but for each industry and for each research topic, you'll know almost who's the supporter, who's against it, who's neutral. And so you want to understand on that spectrum, where is your audience at? And then the 4th one would be, well, what can I tell these individuals about my findings that will capture their attention and respond to gaps in their evidence base? And a good way to think about this is, well, will they be more motivated by economic concerns, or will they be more motivated by social justice concerns or by environmental concerns? What is going to really make them listen? What are the things that motivate them? What are the things that matter to them? And any organization will have some sort of mandate or manifesto or about us, what are our values, what we care about. And so you want to match that with what you've been working on and communicate to them, leading with that argument you know they care about. And then finally, you're kind of thinking a little bit into the future in terms of what changes would you want to see happen as a result of them understanding that research and reading that 2-page document. What do you want them to do? You could think of call to action or next steps, but it's really helpful to think about that, because that then frames the content that you'll put into this. And many researchers, you'd be surprised, but for many researchers, this is the first time they actually think, yeah, actually, what do I want out of this? And it could be as simple as, you know, you want to start a conversation to talk more about how these findings could be implemented, or you could offer more concrete policy recommendation and changes depending on where you're at with your research. And so now that you've done part 1, you've established what your aim is, you know who your audience is, you want to start creating your visual format. And I've kept it a bit format agnostic here because, well, what format you're going to create is going to be so dependent on who your audience is, how do they typically consume information, what makes most sense for your research and your skills and your capacity and your resources. So it's all these things to keep in mind. But on the screen here, you'll see a table, summary of formats, and this is my attempt at creating a summary of the formats that I've seen researchers produce over and over again. This table is part of my upcoming book called The Guide to Communicating Research for Researchers and Research Communicators, which is going to be launching on the 2nd of March here live in the UK, and will be then available on Amazon. It's a very big milestone, and I'm very, very excited for it. It's been 2 years in the making. So this is the first time I talk about it in a public, formal setting. So saying it out loud feels very exciting to me. So in this table, we have here a bunch of different formats, from infographics, one-pagers, visual summaries, and policy briefs. And you can read more on the screen. But I've tried to categorize them into length, whether they're short or long, whether they're static or dynamic, and whether they can be or are suitable for print or digital dissemination. So for the purposes of today's workshop, I cannot cover all of them, but I will cover some that I see being repeated over and over again, and that are very versatile and useful to create. Thank you so much, Ben, for the sweet congratulations in the comments. So I'm going to go over several formats, as I said. So the first one is going to be a policy brief, and this is especially useful for those of you who are targeting policymakers, who are tracking the policy developments and legislation developments happening in your field, and who want to produce a formal document that you know is going to respond to those gaps in evidence, can support decision-making, crucially by including recommendations. So you would never produce, I mean, you could, but best practice is to not produce a policy brief that doesn't have concrete recommendations at the end of what you want that policymaker to do after reading your research. And to create a policy brief, you really need to have that deep understanding of what's going on at the policy level and how your research fits into that. And I'll show you some real examples. I'll hold them out. I'll stop sharing my screen and show them to you in a little bit, so you can see what they look like being held in my hand. The second one I mentioned, I showed this example in Harveen's quote, but it's infographics, which are especially helpful for visualizing quantitative data. Again, a big difference here in terms of communicating research for those who have to communicate predominantly quantitative data or qualitative data. And I think infographics are especially useful for those quantitative folks who have to communicate data in more creative and engaging ways. And then finally, visual summaries. And I often get asked, well, what's the difference between a visual summary and an infographic? And I like to think of it as the visual summary being especially good for qualitative data. So when you are really, when you don't have numbers or stats that you could communicate in an infographic, a visual summary is that catch-all that can include icons and visual elements. And I'll show you some case studies and examples later today. You break up that text with different visual elements to make the experience of reading this document much more engaging and user-friendly. So these are the ones that we see being repeated and requested for over and over again with our clients. But in the book, whole chapter 4 essentially looks at how to create an engaging format, specifically in depth, for 4 options. So the one-pager, the one-pager, the infographic, the visual summary, and the policy brief. I go through a step-by-step approach of how we create these in terms of text and design. But then I also cover other formats, not in as much detail, but certainly giving insights into and examples of what we've seen of researchers communicating their work in videos and animations, interactive reports, comics. One of my favorite ones to create. We've had the pleasure of creating some amazing comics in terms of orangutan conservation last year, exhibitions, real life exhibitions in person, theater plays, and games as well. So how can you turn your research into a game? So there's so many different formats you could choose from, but for the purposes of today, I thought it'd be useful to give you a structure of essentially what would you include in a 2-page visual summary, which would probably be the most generic format. Anyone can produce a 2-page visual summary. Actually, anyone can produce a 1-pager from their research. But I think the 2-pager gives you just a little bit more space, a little bit more real estate to pack in some information about your work. And this was the concrete output from the Now What program that Alicia mentioned at the beginning of the training today, where I took PhD students through a 4-week process of producing this with them. And at the end, their final deliverable was a 2-page visual summary. I've got yours, Alicia. I can share in a little bit if you'd be so happy to share some thoughts on that. But the suggested structure is essentially title. We've got the context and a problem statement. So what's the problem that your research is addressing? Who is affected by this problem? What's the geographical reach of this problem? And this is probably even for the qualitative research folks, you could probably articulate or think of some numbers here in terms of how many people are affected by the problem or the geographical extent of the problem. Then you'd want to introduce your solution. And actually a better way to explain, to title this section would be, our approach rather than solution, because it's basically how you approach the research. This in effect would be your methodology, but we don't want to call it methodology because again, the audience here is non-academic. So we want to remove the jargon as much as possible. So what's your approach? And this is a top level solution of how many documents you reviewed, or what countries' policies did you investigate, or how many interviews did you have and over what period of time, and what was your sample, and what country or what area did your research take place in. Then you want to go into your findings, and if you don't have findings yet, because you don't know what the findings are, you're still in the process of figuring those out, you might have early implications or early themes or anticipated findings, something along those lines. Finally, you'll have your call to action, that next step that you want people to take. And at the very end, you will include a footer with contact details where people can find out more information about you, how they can get in touch, and read more. This is what Tony was saying. You can always follow up with more information. Absolutely every single one of the products we produce at Research Retold has in the footer information about how people can get in touch with the researcher, where they can find out more information, usually a link to an academic article or to a DOI a publication, that sort of thing. So you'll know this is not a flyer, a leaflet, a marketing leaflet that someone has produced on a topic. It is an evidence-based, research-based, visually engaging document. This is very, very important. So as a recap, then, you will get clarity on your aim and the audience. You'll think of how to address that audience in a central research message. So you will think, when you're addressing policymakers or the general public or businesses, you'll want to articulate for yourself a central research message that you think is going to be absolutely essential to communicate to these people. And that guides you. You don't have to write it anywhere, but that guides your writing efforts. Then you will select the appropriate format, either from the list that I shared, or it can be other formats as well that you decide. You'll draft the content for it. You'll then visually enhance the content. You will refine, disseminate, and then finally evaluate the efforts that you've been putting in. In terms of the writing, the content that you are going to be putting together in this slide, in this section, one of the tools that I found quite interesting to share with people in workshops is this Flesch-Kincaid readability tool. And Flesch-Kincaid is a tool that people use to identify what is the approximate education level that someone needs to have to understand or read a particular text easily. And so depending on what audience you are targeting, using a tool like this can really help you see, well, does someone have to have a PhD to be able to understand my 2-page visual summary? If that's the case, you will want to really work on the readability of that text. And I find this to be extremely helpful to get that external perspective if you don't have someone who can help give you feedback straight away on your document. And so as far as content considerations goes and writing considerations, the language needs to feel accessible and direct. You want to keep that audience profile in mind, and it can always be followed up with more material. Remember that you don't want to give everything away. you'll want to use that structure. So whether it's the structure that I suggested or another structure, you want to make sure your short format has an easy structure that you can navigate. You ensure the headings tell a story, that you're using straightforward language, spotting and shortening any sentences or saying things in a simple way. Think of what areas you could be breaking up into bullet points and spelling out any acronyms, which is something I see academics miss all the time, making sure your formatting is consistent and keeping in mind that in 2 pages, you probably have about 700 words maximum to include in there. So actually, it might feel scary, but it can also feel a bit of a relief because you realize, well, I can only split 700 words in 5 sections in one way. So you have to make some pretty harsh decisions of what you put in and what you leave out. And another tool that I find really helpful, and there is a link to this, which I'll include in the handout, is the Hemingway app, which again helps you as a tool to just plop your text in there once you've created it and see if it can help you identify any sentences that you're completely missing as being too long or too hard to read. And you can tweak with your text to make it more readable. And it gives you a very, very helpful grade here to assess readability. So let's look at some case studies. So I'm going to start by sharing you some case studies on the screen, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will show them to you on camera. Okay, so this is a case study. This is a policy brief that just landed on our doorstep today. Is a policy brief created for a very, very select group of policymakers looking at pandemic preparedness, which is something that's going on in the world right now, where all member states are going to, in May, June, going to be asked to put aside a significant bunch of resources to prepare for what seems to be the next pandemic happening imminently. But actually, these researchers are looking at, well, actually, what is the data that these claims are based on? And so in their method here, they called it method, they just specifically say what data they analyzed and what they included, but in just a very, very simple paragraph here. So not trying to give too much detail into that, focusing instead on the analysis. Now, keep in mind, this policy brief is particularly wordy, and it is 4 pages. There's another page on this. But for their context, for their audience, for their target, for their aims, this made sense to them. And it was especially also in a demand-driven scenario where they were responding to a very, very specific request for evidence. So they tailored the format to what the needs of their audience were. And within the context of this, we made it more engaging and appealing and gave it a cohesive visual identity to really make what was a Word document be more engaging. The other document is a 6-page impact report. In fact, you know what? I'm going to just stop sharing my screen now and show you this in person because I think it is more engaging this way. So hopefully you can all see me now. So this is the 4-page policy brief that I just showed you on screen. And this is a document that they are going to take to meetings, but they have been invited to present this evidence. Yes, they will have their presentation, but they're also coming prepared to that presentation with a handout for those audiences to read afterwards or before, and to get the summary, the high-level summary of what their 110-page report is saying. The other document is the 6-page impact report that we created for a local community organization, talking about the impact they have had over the last 6 years with their programs. And so this document is meant to be used to secure more funding, get more partners on board. And they have many, many meetings where they're being invited to talk about what they're doing and how they are utilizing the resources that they have. And so this document for them encapsulates the impact of what they've been doing, and they're able to engage with people in a different way using something like this. This document as well, the content here was completely, dissected into social media assets. So everything here was repurposed in different ways to help them with communicating these messages across different channels as well. This is an example of a 2-page infographic. This is on the topic of classical music listening habits. So the research looked at whether classical music reviews matters in terms of people's listening habits. I mean, part of the beauty of this job is I get to learn about so many different kinds of research. But this was primarily an infographic, and it used infographics were used to visualize the answers to very key questions in their survey. And then here at the end, they have a call to action in terms of how people can get involved with the research further and be part of the next phase of the research. And then finally, another one I want to show you is on the point on petitions. Why do petitions matter? And this was a 4-page visual summary that these researchers created to communicate the findings of a report on the impact of petitions and how they have been used as an effective method of engaging with parliamentarians for the last 100 years. So what these documents have in common is the understanding of using accessible language, but also visual elements to make sure that their findings come across in an engaging way. So the next part of my talk, and Sherry, it would be really helpful if in the chat you can give me an appreciation of how much time I've got left. I'm banking on another 9 minutes, but if you tell me less, then I will be sure to take that into consideration. Perfect. Yes, good. We are on the same page. So why use visuals? I mean, you are attending this workshop today, so I'm imagining you understand the importance of visuals, but it makes your insights stand out. It helps your audience to easily grasp complex concepts, that's a mouthful, and it helps to persuade your audience. So principles, general principles here in this quick 45-minute talk. You want to be accurate, you want to tell the truth, no cherry picking of the data. You want to use color to highlight ideas. You want to highlight the insight for people. I should start with that one. Highlight the insight, do the thinking for your audience. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen a graph have a title such as number of school meals in this area, or something like that. Number of people affected by this illness. It doesn't tell you anything about whether it's high compared to the national average, or is it lower compared to the national average. It doesn't give you any insight into what that is. I have to do the thinking as the reader to understand the graph and to figure out what that key message is. If you know what the key message is of your graph, put that in the title. Put that in the title, and don't let your audience figure out what that is. Guide them to do that thinking with you. Using colors, shapes, and positions, size and space to accentuate your key messages. So what I want to do now is run through for my quantitative researchers today. In the handout, you'll receive a link to this infographic, helpfully designed as an infographic of the different kinds of charts that you could use for your data. So there's a bunch of different options there, and it really helps to think based on the purpose of your visualization, what kind of chart would work best for that. And for the qualitative researchers on the call today, I'll give some examples as well, but essentially you want to think, what can be visual in my research, yeah? So is it, for the qualitative people, is it quotes perhaps? Is it maps? Is it diagrams, tables, images, or local logos? What would work for or from my research? And if this is the first time you're ever doing anything visual from your research, you want to keep it simple. You want to have 1 or 2 visuals maximum per page. You want to look at your organizational brand guidelines. If this was just one university, I would have found those out for you, but your university in Google plus brand guidelines should come up with a search that gives you what the color palette is and what the font is to make it easier for you. And there's also a bunch of free tools and templates you could use online. In the Now What program, we used Canva as a software, but there are so many others you can experiment with online. I would say Canva free gives you a pretty good starting point to go with. And this is what Canva looks like, and they have lots of different templates there. I'm going to send out a feedback form at the end of this. If you want to know more information about this, you can let me know. given the case studies. So I'm actually going to, at the end of this, Alicia, if that's okay with you, I'm going to ask you to give just a few thoughts on the process of creating a visual summary. And then as you do that, I'll show people the visual summary, but I want to get to the Q&A as well. So we'll do that at the end, if that's okay. I'm just giving you a heads up. So if you're thinking, oh, my research is not visual, what could I possibly do visually with it? Well, here are some examples of very simple layout and text and color use that just makes the page more visually interesting than just a Word document with this text on it, and using icons where appropriate to bring interest to the page. You might want to also use icons next to a description, and that can also help to bring some interest to the page, whether these are generic icons that you can find on Canva, or whether you design specific icons for your text. This can make your insights stand out. You can organize your information in a table and use smart use of color to visually communicate that message. So it goes here from red to green, from a very pessimistic scenario to a very optimistic scenario. You could create diagrams simply by using text and quotes from the research. So this was not necessarily a diagram that was produced for the research, but because of the way the information was structured in, this was a paragraph to begin with, we then decided to break this up into a yes or no question, and then the reader could read what the outcome of that, like a decision tree. So this was created purely from text that we had. We could also create images or create a diagram. So for example, here for this policy brief, we had a list of how many countries are there? 12 countries of governments with new or amended policies on wildlife trade in response to the pandemic. And this was just a list, but we decided to bring a visual element to the page by creating a map. You could also create a visual metaphor for the entire document. So if, for example, here, grassroots engagement approach was the method, the method of conducting the research, we use that as a visual metaphor to hold the text itself on the page and to communicate that idea of a consultation and engagement with the community. You could also include images from other artists, as long as you give them credit, whether reaching out to them and including something that is very, very specific and relevant to your research. As long as you add an image credit to that person, it should be okay. But double points if you reach out to that person and get their permission. But it is something that you can include. It really fits very well with your work. Or you can create a diagram yourself, again, based on the text. Imagine this is a list of bullet points. What are the challenges of health financing? And this was a list with 8 different bullet points, which would have been not very visually exciting. But if you put it in this shape, it all of a sudden creates a visual element that is bringing more interest to the page. You could create mind maps, and Canva actually has mind map templates that you could be using. Again, it all depends on the information that you have to work with. You can include photos of your team, or my favorite one is to include photos from field research if you have them. You can create various illustrations. For example, remember how I told you about that problem statement? Here, the problem was, what are the negative impacts of social isolation and loneliness? And one of the key stats here is as damaging to health as smoking 15 cigarettes in a day. Now, again, this list was a list of 8 different bullet points that we decided to put on a map, because the visual metaphor here is that the app was locating people on a map of the city. So just a more engaging way to put those 8 different points in a visual. So the last 5 minutes I want to spend thinking about dissemination. So you'll remember from the slide in which I gave an overview of the process, the work does not stop once you've created your first draft. You'll want to send it to colleagues, PhD supervisor, other researchers that can give you feedback. You will have put it through the tools that we gave today to figure out what you might want to tweak from the text. You'll be going through some refinements, and in the Now Up program, we definitely went through at least 2 to 3 rounds of feedback and iteration. But once you have that, you're now ready to share it with people. And this can feel really, really scary. But it is really where the magic happens, because you start sending it to people, yes, you expose yourself to criticism, but this is where research communication happens, when you're sending it out to the people you started thinking about at the beginning. So some very simple ideas here. I'm trying to keep it simple, but making you visible on your academic profile, including a link to your email signature, sharing the link of your on your social media if you have any. If not, making use of organizational social media channels, your department, your societies you might be involved in. You might want to reach out to identified stakeholders, introduce yourself via email, and share the two-pager in an email attachment to them, introducing your research and how it could benefit them. If you have any events planned or conferences planned you want to disseminate at those events, you might want to think, how can I repurpose this content in a creative way? Now that you've gone through this process to create your two-page visual summary or infographic, could you break that up into different images you could include in a blog post for your departmental blog, or create a little series of social media posts that you could put online? It all depends on what your goals are and your audience, but these are some different ideas. And also translating it into a different language can be a simple idea. It takes a little bit more time, but it does increase the reach of your of your research. And finally, ideas that take even a little bit more time is, could you be looking at what podcasts there are that would be interested in your research or that cover research in your area that you could reach out to and send them the two-pager and introduce your work and see if they'd be interested to have you on as a guest. It's the same process that you would go through. You'd have an audience in mind when you communicate your research, and the format there is just that conversation that you have with someone, that interview style. But it can really be a great opportunity for you to practice communication of your research in a more active setting. Reaching out to local media, whether that's radio or newspapers, but perhaps a friendlier version of reaching out to local media is to think about the conversation, which I mentioned is a news outlet where only academic researchers can write in. This is the CEO of the conversation here in the UK. I wonder if that's the CEO globally. I'm not sure, but it says that they have a monthly audience of 3 million people, a network of republishers of reaching over 10 millions, and in the UK, we've got 80 UK university members, but I know that there is theconversation.com/Canada. And so here I encourage you to go in, put the name of your university, see if it comes up. It probably should. And then see if you know anyone who's written for it. Reach out to them, ask what their opinion was. It is free to publish, and you can pitch writing about your research. So in terms of a quick wrap up, we're getting very close now. So in brief again, the process of creating that short format, get clarity on the aim and audience, think about your central message, select that appropriate format, draft your content, visually enhance it, refine, disseminate, and then evaluate, reach out to see what impact that has had. It's been a pleasure to present this to you. I want you to stay in touch. I'm going to be in the feedback form that I have prepared for you. I'm going to give you links to our LinkedIn and X account, Twitter account, if you want to connect with us, and you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. And so now it's time for Q&A, and then I'm going to send you a link to the feedback form, unless Sherry advises me otherwise, and we have to email that link to you. But I am open for questions. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mihalia. There was one question about whether there was if you knew of an equivalent for the Flesch-Kincaid calculator in French. So
I can look into that. There must be.
I think there is. I don't know if it's super accessible. I started doing some just quick searches to see if I can find something. So maybe between the two of us, we can come up with a resource.
I think so, because, you know, this is a tool that is, not specifically that link that I'm giving you, but as a practice in the media sector, they use that a lot to set the educational level of media outlets. So usually newspaper have a level of education of, you know, first grader. So really, really simple language, very easy to understand. And the conversation is set at an educated 16-year-old, so it's much higher than your kind of general. So I'm imagining that is a tool that can be found in other languages. But yeah, that's a good tip there. So I'm going to look into that. I think I saw
No,
that
I
one.
use that one frequently too. The
You do?
calculator for all kinds of things now. Anytime I do any work, I use it now.
Nice. That's such
Yeah.
good feedback. I'm so glad. Let's see, what other questions do we have? And the feedback form is in the chat. I really appreciate if you could fill that in. That would be super helpful for me.
Yeah, and something that we also want to ask, are requesting for participants too, is if you do proceed to create a visual, we want you to share it with us and we'll disseminate it, give some feedback and disseminate it on our social media channels. So that's kind of our call to action for you for this presentation is dive in, give it a try.
Totally.
So if anyone has any questions, you can put them either in the chat or the question and answer box. I know, when you talk about the process, the importance, that front end part, it can be hard to grasp that importance. I know that was the part that I struggled with the most in that process, was narrowing down an audience. Once you have your audience nailed, then, because in all honesty, I ended up with probably 15 different audiences and we did a lot of conversation back and forth on how to condense that. So
Absolutely. It's exciting to think about the visual aspect first, but thinking about the audience is that kind of groundwork you can't really skip, especially when you only have 700 words and a few opportunities for visuals.
So a question just came in, is a policy brief a form of visual document?
Yes, if you work with Research Retold, or if you've been to a Research Retold workshop, it has to be. Everything you do that is meant, in my view, that is meant for a non-academic audience, you want to include visuals in there. Now, when I say visuals, academics are typically thinking about graphs in Excel, which, yes, can be a visual, but I'm encouraging you here to think about the presentation of that document that looks more polished, more put together, and more engaged. It just shows that you've made that little bit more effort into the presentation of your document, which can go such a long way. And I hear this feedback over and over from researchers too, whose audiences are surprised when they see these documents because they just don't expect research to be communicated in this way. So policy briefs can be visual, they should be visual, and they should be formatted and polished to that same degree as much as possible. And if you just type in policy brief on your topic, or there's just so much inspiration that you can see online. Some are better than others. We have some examples on our website as well, but yeah, I'd encourage you to think about visual elements in your policy brief as well. Thank you so much.
I feel like that's really important because I recently had to meet with the Deputy Minister of Corrections, and you get very small snippets of time. So the easier it is and something you can actually give them, the greater the likelihood that you'll get some engagement from them.
That's right. I mean, I think all audiences are time poor, but specifically policymakers will give you 10 minutes of their time and you really have to pitch for 10 minutes and you need to cut to the chase. You just need to explain clearly what that policy relevance is of your research. And then crucially, maybe leave them with something at the end of that meeting I've prepared as a follow-up.
There's a second question that builds off that, though. Is there a risk that policymakers feel infantilized by too many visuals?
I don't know if too many visuals is the problem, but what kind of visuals? I mean, it's all contextually appropriate. I mean, I wouldn't say to you now that you know how we went through those different formats. I wouldn't say you'd produce a comic to talk well, you might if you want to tell them the story that a person is going through daily, that say they're affected, for example, if they're affected by austerity and policymakers are putting these policies in place that drive austerity, then you might consider, okay, I'm going to create a comic that shows a policymaker the daily life of this person and how that affects them. But I've never come across a policymaker that complained by the information being too visual or too easy to read. If anything, it's the opposite of them complaining about it not being too visual, not being easy to read. Even just in terms of how it is formatted. I mean, you'd be so surprised to see blocks of text, just blocks of text, paragraphs of text. There's no headings, no way to scan that information. If I'm looking at a page and I want to just scan the headings, do I know where to go to read about the problem? Do I know where to go to read about the findings? And that is such a simple editing. Doesn't take a lot of time, but it can make such an impact for someone who has 5 minutes to look at something, to scan that document. So yeah, Marie, I wouldn't worry about infantilizing policymakers, but use visuals that are appropriate, for your topic.
And that's interesting that you bring up the headings and scanning documents, because I think that applies even to, as graduate students, our funding proposals. We often just have walls of text. Having headings that break it up makes it easier to read, and there's a better flow. And so it's also refreshing for, funders to get something like that too. So there's a greater chance of getting money to do what we love.
Absolutely. But it makes such a huge difference, doesn't it? Especially in those long applications where you think, okay, how can I make it as easy as possible for this person to find the information that they're looking for?
Exactly.
Nice. Yeah.
So we still, we have a couple more minutes. If there's any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Also, just as a primer, interesting that you brought the conversation in, because we have a panel, our final panel on March 8th coming up, and it's called media. It's media training, how to communicate your research to the public via social media or news outlets. And we have someone from the conversation who will be on the panel. So tune in for that.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. That's really cool. And I'd say in preparation for that, do see if you can find someone that who's written for the conversation and get some insight into their experience. Because it can be such a great way to just practice communicating your research to that audience. And it's free because your organizations pay for it. So definitely make the most of that opportunity.
Perfect. I think if there's no further questions anyone has, and to respect everyone's time, thank you very much for attending, and thank you so much for the informative talk. This has been great. We really, really appreciate your insights. Like I said, our call to action to all of you who've attended is give it a try, send them to us, the students at csa-scs.ca, and we'll give you feedback, but we're also looking at, we can promote through our social media channels as well. So thank you very much again.
Super. It was lovely to see you all, to have you all. Thank you so much.